Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kennedy Cole, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. I'm excited to welcome you to our second webinar in the series Cities for All, creating communities that can be accessed and enjoyed by everyone. This series is co-sponsored by Cura, the Age-Friendly Innovation Center, and the United Way of Central Ohio. Throughout this series, speakers from various fields will discuss how cities can approach urban planning in a way that prioritizes serving the diverse needs of residents. Today, Tim Gill will show how a children's lens can transform cities into inclusive, equitable, livable, and sustainable places that are fit for the challenges of the 21st century. Before we introduce Tim, I want to mention a few logistical items. If you require closed captioning today, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen labeled with CC. Click the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to view subtitles during the presentation. During the webinar, feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation, and if we do not get to your question, apologies in advance. Chat has been disabled, so please use the Q&A if you have any information to share with the organizers. I do want to mention that we're having some issues today with the manual captioning. So I'm going to send in the chat a link that you can go to receive manual captioning if you require it. As you may have seen on our website, this event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credits, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter the event into your online CM event log. There will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have time, we encourage you to provide your feedback to improve these events. If you have any additional questions following this event, don't hesitate to email us at cura@osu.edu. To learn more about Cura's future events or sign up for our monthly newsletter, visit cura.osu.edu. You can learn more about the Age-Friendly Innovation Center at agefriendly.osu.edu and the United Way of Central Ohio at liveunitedcentralohio.org. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Harvey Miller, Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Kennedy, and welcome everyone to our second edition of this webinar series in spring 2026 on Cities for All. And I'm very happy to introduce Tim Gill. Tim Gill is an independent scholar, writer, and consultant based in London. He has been making the case for children's outdoor play and mobility for over 30 years. Tim is the author of Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities, and No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. And today he'll talk about child-friendly urban planning and design. What, so what, and now what? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harvey, and hello, everyone. I'm particularly delighted to be speaking to you folks with a connection with Ohio for reasons that will become clear in a second. You're looking, I hope, at an image of this is a part of a super block, so a kind of reconfigured street in Barcelona in Spain, and it captures nicely the kind of two themes that you'll see running through my talk about that child-friendly places bring together two ingredients. Firstly, things to do for kids, lots of choice and variety. But secondly, and just as important, child-friendly places are easy to get around on foot or by bike. So I'll be really hopefully if you leave with nothing else from this talk, leave with those two ingredients. I said the Ohio link is oh now what's happening here? Okay, there we go. The Ohio link is that I was once a proud resident of that fair state. You're looking now at Omar Circle, the street I used to live in Yellow Springs, Ohio, at the formative age of 6 and 7 years. And what's kind of interesting is I was thinking about this very street as I was preparing for this talk, and I think you could argue that there are some child-friendly qualities to the design of this street. Now, the key thing is that you won't see this from the image here, but it's effectively a cul-de-sac, so there's no through traffic in this street. So I have really vivid memories. In fact, as its name implies, it's a circle, it's a loop. Uh, Really clear memories of riding, scooting, roller skating up and down this street with my friends, long hours of the day. And you can just see maybe in that image the basketball hoop over to the right, just kind of maybe suggesting that there's a interesting culture in this street of kind of sharing even private space in a kind of public way. Okay. I think when we're thinking about children's spatial lives, one thing that we can all draw on is our memories of our own childhoods. And this map that you're looking at kind of captures something really important about how childhood has been changing. So what you're seeing is a map that shows you what you might call the roaming range or the home territory of four children at the age of 8 years old. But as you can maybe see from the text, they're in four generations of the same family who all lived in the same city. So the big blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that is the roaming range of the great grandfather in this family at the age of 8. He could travel 6 miles across the city on his own. And then you can see how the circles shrink until you get to the son in the family, the yellow dot up in the top left. He's actually allowed to go to the end of his street. But what this illustrates really neatly is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And it's one of the most important and underexplored changes in children's lives. Why is it happening? It's complicated. But one of the reasons I'm absolutely clear is changes in the physical nature of neighborhoods, the design of neighborhoods, the presence and the dominance of cars. Um, and just to say, I think that one of the reasons I use this image, which by the way, is not mine, but I've taken it, is that it's a really compelling starting point for thinking about children's lives today and opening up conversations, especially with different generations. That's Yes, the nostalgia bell is ringing, and I'm not saying that, there was a golden age for kids to grow up or that today's kids are going to hell in a handcart. But I am saying there's something really important. There's a story here that we need to explore about children's lives. Because one of the things this tells us is that children have an appetite for experience. The young of our species are nature's most efficient learning machines, and much of what we learn from our own explorations, from our own adventures, and from our own mistakes. And so childhood is, amongst other things, a kind of journey from dependence, utter dependence on adults through to gradually gaining more independence and autonomy. And so um, exploration in the broadest sense is central to how children learn and grow healthy and happy. And yet, if we think about how urban planners, how people who shape cities, how do we feed this appetite for experience? What provision do we make for children's exploration and play and learning? Well, typically, I'm sorry to say that this is the default. Yeah, this is the go-to recipe. Now, of course, this is a particularly woeful example, but what I want you to see here is it's not just that this is contemptuous, but it's the wrong model. Okay, the model we've got here is effectively creating reservations for children. And my argument is that child-friendly places are not reservations. And I'll come back to that. So I'm going to be talking more about what I think child-friendly urban planning and design is, why I think it matters. I'm going to give a couple of case studies and also some US initiatives in a kind of whistle-stop tour, and then close with some thoughts about how we make these things happen. So a lot of my material is going to draw on a handful of cities, maybe 10 or 20, that I've studied in some detail and in many cases visited. These are all cities, they're quite varied. They're not necessarily very child friendly right now, but they are all cities that have taken seriously the goal of becoming more child friendly in physical terms. And I was lucky enough to have had a travel scholarship and had support from the wonderful Urban 95 program from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation to do that. So, if we think about child-friendly urban planning, we're naturally drawn to think about, well, what makes neighborhoods work for children and families? And this graphic tries to show the three basic ingredients of a place that works well for families. In really simple terms, uh, so first you have housing. If you don't have family-friendly housing, with enough bedrooms and so on, then no families ever, or very few families will move to a neighborhood or live there. You need services, schools, childcare, family health, but it's the public realm, that third plank, that I'm most interested in and that I'll be focusing on, because this is where children, as they grow up, gradually step outside of the family life of their role as school children or institutions and really stake their claim in public life. So I think it's the most interesting and in a way the most symbolically important aspect of thinking about how children make a claim on society. And I argue that a child-friendly place has got two dimensions in physical terms. As I've said already, one dimension is what you might call the things to do dimension. That a child-friendly place has a lot, essentially, it's not boring. It's a place where there's variety and choice of things to do and places to go for children of different ages and interests, boys and girls, different cultural interests, leisure interests. So there's a lot of choice and variety. That's one dimension, but that's not enough on its own because children also need to be able to get to those different places and spaces. So the second dimension is children's mobility, in particular, walking and biking and wheeling. So it's only where a place has got both a lot of choice and variety in terms of spaces and facilities, and it's easy for children of different ages, with and without their parents, to get around, that you're in that child-friendly zone. And one kind of neat way that planners have tried to sort of conceptualize or a metaphor for this vision is the popsicle test. What's the popsicle test, I hear you ask? Okay, it's kind of simple. It's imagine that you're the parent of, let's say, an 8-year-old child. Is your neighborhood a neighborhood where you are willing to let your child, let your 8-year-old leave your house, get to a corner store and buy a popsicle, and they're able to get back home before the popsicle melts? Okay, so it's a location specific test. It's also, and I'm saying this with the full knowledge of Ohio's climate, it's a seasonal test. But what it brings together nicely is those two factors of the kind of facilities side of things, choices, variety, things to do, and the getting around dimension. And it pulls those two together in this kind of pictorial test. So ask yourself whether your neighborhood is a neighborhood that would pass the popsicle test. We're back at Omar Circle now. You can see the Google map. It actually, in some respects, in a literal sense, does not really pass the popsicle test, at least so far as I can tell. The nearest corner store from where I would have been living in Omar Circle is about a mile and a half away. So a good 30 minutes. And I think on a summer day in Ohio, that popsicle wouldn't stand a chance. One place where the popsicle test, I think, would get passed is this neighborhood. And this is a neighborhood that I hold up in my book as being possibly the ultimate child-friendly neighborhood. Now, there's a question mark there. It's a lighthouse or a compass point. It's not a blueprint, but what you're looking at is the neighborhood of Vauban, which is a district of about 6,000 population in the German city of Freiburg. And you can maybe see from this aerial, the aerial shot, that it's apartment living. So it's reasonably dense. There's a lot of green space. It's mixed use, so you've got businesses and retail as well as housing. But what really marks out Vauban from other similar neighborhoods is that it's in essence a car-free district. Now, you can own a car if you live in Vauban, but firstly, you have to pay a lot of money to park your car. And secondly, you can't park your car outside your house. I'll come back to that. But in the meantime, here's one image of one of the nice things about Vauban is there aren't really many playgrounds in the sense of fenced off play areas. There's a lot of green space, and you do see playful features like this slide woven into those green spaces. But it's a very different vision. So one of the things about Vauban is that all of the space between the buildings is available for public use. It's genuinely public space because it's not being dominated by the car. So here is a couple more images of different types of public space in the area. The streets, there is a network of streets, and cars can go down the street. So you can take your furniture or your delivery to your front door, but the streets are largely filled with people walking and biking. And indeed, Vauban is a kind of model that planners from all around the world have been visiting ever since the district was first started being developed in the 1990s. And one of the things that many people who visit comment on is just how many people there are, especially children, out and about in this district. This isn't a stage photo, it really is like that. And these are just two images that pull out. Firstly, on the left, you can see one of the you could call it a car barn, really, a huge, well, fairly big car park, but it's on the edge of the district. And the other thing about Vauban is that it has really effective, reliable public transport from this part of town into the city centre. So this sort of schematic tries to illustrate some of those, how those features come together in this idealized version of Vauban. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these elements, but really what you've got here is kind of two layers. You've got one layer, which is, if you like, a kind of sustainable, medium density, mixed development. So that's fairly typical of many European districts. But the second layer is explicitly making this neighborhood more friendly for children. So focusing on the different types of public space, the play space, the sports and recreation, the meeting spaces, how the streets can be social space. So it's those two layers coming together that really lift Vauban into somewhere exceptional. So that's the picture, or one picture I want you to have in your mind. Now I want to explain why this vision, why this approach matters. And I was really interested to find out, I mentioned the cities I visited earlier. Why were the city leaders in this pool of cities, why were they interested in child-friendly planning? Why did they think it mattered? And so I asked city leaders that question. And this Venn diagram shows the broad answers that city leaders gave me. So in a bunch of cities, people indeed talked about children explicitly. They wanted their city to be healthier for children, to recognize children's rights and children's claim on the city and children's well-being. Then there's a second group of cities that talked more about sustainability and community. And really the idea they latched onto was that a child-friendly city, what does it look like? Well, it's compact, it's green, it's easy to get around on foot or by bike. It looks a lot like a sustainable city. But then there's a third group of cities that you can see that talked about their economy and their demographics. And in a way, this is the most interesting set. So these were cities that had grasped the insight that a city that does not attract and retain families is a city whose long-term future is not great. Okay. And Rotterdam is the best example of that. I'm going to say more about Rotterdam in a minute. But one more thing about this diagram. One thing I hope you can see is that quite a lot of cities are in the intersections. They're in the overlaps. They could see win-wins. They could join the dots between these different broad headings. And I think what that points to is how a children's lens can really help synthesize and show solutions across different domains of the problems that cities face. So just say a little bit more about each of those three headings. It is sadly the case that children's health and well-being are in decline pretty much around the world. This happens to be an AI screen grab I took the other day. Just a reminder here to always check what AI tells you. But in this case, I can tell you it's right. There are worrying trends in children's mental health, children's physical activity that we're seeing globally. So there's a real problem here. And maybe you're aware there's a particular conversation, a very lively conversation going on right now about children's mental health and if you like, the role of screens and children's young people's digital lives in their mental health and well-being. And a lot of that's been triggered by Jonathan Haidt, the American social psychologist, and his book, The Anxious Generation. But one of the things that people sometimes miss about Haidt is he doesn't just say we need to regulate or manage children's screen time or their digital lives. He also says we need to create more space and time uh, for children to play and socialize IRL in real life. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And that's, again, COVID, which Harvey mentioned, is a reminder of the importance of simply being out and connected and active and how that matters for children's health and well-being. It is also the case that if we take the time to ask children and youth themselves what they would like to do in their lives, and in particular, what they'd like to spend more time doing, they're consistently telling us that they want to spend more time with their friends playing in person and doing things in real life. They're with online activity a fairly distant third in terms of their own preferences. There's also heaps of evidence about the health and developmental benefits of outdoor play, nicely captured in this infographic that you can see. Also, I think interesting there's a body of research that shows that children who are more active in their neighborhoods, in particular children who travel around their neighborhoods or travel to school under their own steam, are more connected and have a better picture, a richer understanding of how their neighborhood works, how it fits together than children who are driven everywhere. And that's what these two drawings from two different children is illustrating. Just briefly touching on the kind of economic argument, this quote is a quote from a leading British property developer, very wealthy man who's built big chunks of my city, London, who is convinced that cities and districts that attract families are better than any marketing campaign at showing the qualities and the attractions of an area. But it is also true that different groups and sections of society have got differential access and ability to enjoy and spend time in public space. And you can see that reflected in the quote here from the American academic Isis Ferguson, pointing out that gender, race, class, these intersectional qualities all shape people's and children's access to neighbourhood facilities in ways that are fairly predictable. Finally, it is true that if we take the time to ask children what they like and what they don't like about where they live, the answers they give map very neatly onto that two-dimensional framework of choice and variety on the one hand, and ability to get around, free movement, everyday freedoms on the other. So if you pull all this together, you get the kind of picture that Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, captures nicely in this quote. He talks about children being a kind of indicator species. And I really like that metaphor. Think back to Vauban, the district I was talking about, and the fact that children are very active and visible. I would argue that in the same way that when you see salmon swimming in a river, it's a sign of the quality of that habitat. If you see, as you do in Vauban, children of different ages, both genders, with and without their parents, being active and visible in that human habitat, it's a sign of quality. Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies now. The first is Rotterdam, that I've already flagged up as a compelling case study. Rotterdam, I devote a whole chapter to the city in my book, and it's probably invested more hard cash in becoming more child friendly than any other city I know. And the story starts with the finding that Rotterdam was found to be the worst place, or was felt to be the worst place in the Netherlands to bring up a child. Okay, so it was bottom of the league table of family-friendly cities. And that is not a league table that any city wants to be propping up. So it ran a number of programs and invested tens of millions of dollars over more than a decade in really smart ways, targeting particular neighborhoods. It did, and it's important to say this, it did focus on a number of topic areas, but urban planning and design was a big piece of the picture. And it also measured the impact. So you can see one neighborhood where money and agencies and teams in the city came together to kind of create a sort of a revamped makeover, a child-friendly makeover of this comparatively disadvantaged part of the city, bringing together work on public space, on streets, on school grounds, sports facilities, all working together. And here's one image of some funky traffic calming that was put into this district. We also saw changes to the parking configuration in some of the streets. So one of the goals of Rotterdam is that where it can, if it's doing any public works in a street, it tries to get the agreement of residents to take out some of the parking and extend the sidewalk to make it into a kind of literal doorstep play space, which you can see in this photo. It's also actually converted some car parking in residential areas into public parks, and that's what you can see here. School grounds in a number of schools have been given a kind of green makeover and also opened up so that they're available for community use. And these changes have been embedded in policy. So the city's planners have got a nice set of tools that enable them to look across the neighborhoods that they're working in and figure out what are the neighborhood barriers, where are there shortages of play space, for example, and then to come up with neighborhood-wide schemes to make improvements. And I'll come back to that point about neighborhoods later, because one really important insight here is that families don't live in cities, they live in neighborhoods. Okay, the family life is played out at the neighborhood scale. So we need to look at how those patterns of use in neighborhoods, how family life is woven into the neighborhood fabric. But one of the findings of this program was that, remember the problem here? The problem here was families fleeing Rotterdam and not wanting to leave there. But the neighborhoods that were targeted through this investment program did indeed show an increase in the level of families moving in. So that's my first case study. The second is from my own city, from London. And it's a story of one chunk of a very high profile new district again in the city. So this is the Olympic site where we had our 2012 Olympic Games. And one of the first neighborhoods to be developed is Chobham Manor. And a child-friendly lens was central to the vision for this new neighborhood. And so there's a significant proportion of family homes, but it's apartment living, again, a bit like Vauban. But one of the most prominent ingredients of this new neighborhood was the linear park, the park that you can see in this photo. And one of the nice things about Chobham Manor is that there's a detailed post-occupancy study. So the planners and researchers went back to this part of the new district and carried out detailed interviews with residents about their views on a whole range of topics in order to shape later stages of the Olympic regeneration program. And one of the strongest findings from that post-occupancy evaluation was the importance and the value of that green space that I talked about, the central green. It was described in the report as the community's beating heart, and its value went beyond its day-to-day use. So yes, it became a place for a play space, but it was also a community gathering point and a place where people of different backgrounds, people of different tenures, because this street has both private and social housing in the same street, where they kind of develop the relationships that help to form a healthy community. Okay, I'm just going to touch now on some American schemes that I think are of interest and in this sort of broad ballpark. Boulder, Colorado, a city that I write about in my book, is so far as I can tell, the city that's got the strongest strategic focus on this topic. There's an NGO which is called Growing Up Boulder, which I'll talk about. So that's one example. The second is a program run by the national NGO Kaboom. Historically, we focused on conventional play areas, but trying some different approaches. I'm going to say a bit about bike buses, and finally, I'm going to say something about New York City. So in Boulder, Colorado, the NGO Growing Up Boulder has a strong focus on engaging children and youth and bringing them into the conversations about how the city should change. And one of the flagship projects in that city was a central square. And you can see an image here of the landscaping and the play features in that square. But one of the interesting things about this was that there was a lot of vested interests and competing voices shouting about how this square should change. And one of the values, one of the things that the city, as if you like, the client, found out about involving youth in this was that it helped to kind of overcome and transcend those narrow vested interests and help to develop a more consensus, a better consensus, and for instance, to embed thinking about sustainability and about inclusion into the space. And here's some of the models that some of the children and youth developed with designers to help explore how that place could be designed. Boulder also has a really nice child-friendly, a kid-friendly map that you can find, and that is certainly was for a time a prominent part of the city's messaging to its families. So I mentioned play everywhere. This is a an ambitious and innovative program to create spaces for play and socializing that were not conventional playgrounds. Uh, a bunch of pilots and a few more targeted um, interventions. And you can see one here. This is in Texas, where a bus stop in an underserved area was recognized as being a potential gathering point, if you like, a kind of watering hole where some playful and inviting public space and rest areas could be created. And you can see another image of it here. The third US focused intervention I want to talk about is bike buses. And maybe you've heard of or read about the viral idea of the bike bus. Coach Balto, who is out of Portland, Oregon, has really helped to get this idea to gain traction in social media. And in essence, it's about organized convoys, if you like, of networks of kids biking to school with help from volunteer adults. It's a real spectacle, and it's an idea that's gaining traction in many parts of the world, including several cities in the US. I'm going to say a bit more about this as a kind of software approach a little bit later on. And the final example, which I was lucky enough to see 3 or 4 months ago, is some schemes in New York City, but this one in particular. This is the open street. I think it's 34th Avenue in Queens. It's really impressive. It's about a mile long, more or less pedestrianized or at least traffic-free stretch of this neighborhood. There's about 4 schools that come off of the stretch of the street and at least one district park. And so it's a really nice illustration of how people come out and populate and colonize and enjoy spaces if you make cars less dominant. Now, this scheme emerged originally out of the COVID era tactical short-term changes, but thankfully it's survived and is doing, so far as I can see, a great job in this neighborhood. And there are other schemes running in New York City as well. They tend to be more at the kind of software side of school street programming, but still showing what's possible. And there's 1 or 2 other examples I could talk about as well. In Washington, D.C., there's a school streets program. Okay, how do we get all this to happen? I'm going to offer 5, if you like, recipes or I think kind of smart ideas. I've talked about this already. Focus on the neighborhood scale where you can. Don't just start with a single space or a single street, but look at how you can connect that with how families use neighborhoods. Where are the places that families are going to be every day? This is why school streets are such a great idea, because they do exactly that. Second point, be opportunistic. This is not a mainstream agenda. It's going to be hard. You will meet resistance. So look for ways that you can dovetail or fit in with other interventions, other initiatives, maybe a new development, maybe a park improvement, maybe a school rebuild, and weave in some child-friendly elements to that intervention. Uh, Tackling inequality and exclusion is important, but also hard. It's hard everywhere, but it's particularly hard because one of the things that we know is that actually child-friendly, family-friendly places are attractive. So there is the risk that if you don't explicitly tackle inequality, geographical, spatial inequality, that it is the sharp-elbowed middle classes who will get behind this idea the most strongly. Use hardware and software. So these are, on the one hand, physical changes to public space and programming, events, things like the bike buses that I shared earlier. Make them work together to showcase how neighborhoods could be different. And the final principle or intervention, sorry, implementation idea is seeing children as a unifying lens, as a way of building consensus about long-term collective change. So just a bit about that. In my book, I talk about this sort of model of looking at a neighborhood, almost literally looking down from above and figuring out where are the spaces, where are the connections, where are the barriers, and how can those be addressed. That's an idea that's very well practiced in many towns and cities in Flanders, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. School streets are a really interesting example of an opportunistic model. And one of the best cities that's shown that is Paris. So Paris has carried out something like 300 school street interventions. And in the case of Paris, they've actually closed the streets 24/7. So it's not just a stewarded event that happens maybe an hour twice a day. These have becoming in effect traffic-free public spaces in every neighborhood in Paris. So it's an amazingly ambitious program. Slightly more scaled down version of school streets, but we're seeing hundreds of them in my own city in London. And you can see an image here. So in this case, the street is just closed for about an hour at the beginning and an hour at the end of the day. But what else? The other thing that's going on is that play workers, so staff trained activists, activators are coming out and playing games with the kids. And there's a lot of material online about school streets, hundreds, if not thousands, running around the world. So there's a real bubbling up of interest in that model. And there is now research that shows the improvements that you get with the school street. This is one set of data that shows on a few different measures that school streets are having a real impact on how people feel and how they behave around the school. I talked about also about economic inequality and exclusion. I could spend another half an hour talking about that, but I just want to highlight one topic which I think is really important and often neglected, which is gender, and in particular, the importance of thinking about caregivers, mothers in particular, who and thinking about their travel patterns, because they're very different from the travel pattern that is often the focus of transport planners. Transport planners very often privilege the solo commuter, often the man who leaves the house, goes to their office, comes back. That's simple and well understood and a big focus. But what about the mother who has a complex set of trips, often in their neighborhood, not involving going in to the downtown? How can the transport world have a stronger focus on that? I talked about the hardware and software distinction. In my book, I say a lot about the different hardware elements that you can think about when you're making changes to neighborhoods. But yeah, also remember the software. All I will say about this is I think it's a little bit like with computers, that good software will only take you so far if the hardware is out of date. So if you follow that metaphor, I know people who are working on schemes will say, okay, we can do so much with programming, but we've still got this problem with traffic or with rundown physical spaces. And that ultimately, I think, has to be a long-term focus. I just wanted to have, this is my penultimate slide about how we get this to happen in the US, where there are clearly some challenges that they're not different altogether from challenges in other parts of the world, where I'm living in the UK or in Europe, but I think they're amplified. I think you do have a very individualistic culture where there's always a barrier to overcome about any kind of collective response. Your level of inequalities is higher than in many other comparable high-income countries. You clearly have a set of towns and cities where car dependence is baked in to a much greater extent than it is in many European cities. And as I'm sure you're very familiar with, the culture wars that we're seeing unfolding in public discourse is more extreme and more intractable in the US than it is in many other parts of the world. But these are not differences in kind, they're differences in degree. So I still think there's real scope to get the conversations going, just as we're having here today. Second point, density is your friend. I hope that comes out from a lot of what I've talked about. Remember, the popsicle test is a nice example. And finally, kind of going back in a way to some of those cultural questions, I don't think this is a partisan issue. I think there are people on the right as well as on the left that are making the argument for more family-friendly and child-friendly cities. And you can see a quote there from someone who represents or is involved with one of the more conservative think tanks on the American scene. And so my takeaways are to remind you about thinking about and talking about children's freedoms. What is life like for children in neighborhoods? Always bring into play that two-dimensional framework that I've been repeatedly coming back to. Think about neighborhoods and the neighborhood scale, and think about software as well as hardware. And I think if you can get those approaches embedded, or at least on the table in your own work, then you've got a good chance of building the movement that I invite you to join for making cities work better, not only for children, but for everybody. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. That was great. I'll remind the audience that any questions you have into the Q&A feature. We'll get to them as soon as possible. I'll start with a couple of my own, then I'll turn it over to Kennedy, who will handle the audience questions. I wanted to make a comment, first of all. Your point there about mobility of care, about women's travel patterns being different than men's travel patterns and how we plan for solo commuters. Just for the audience, the first talk in our webinar series this semester was by Leah Ravensburger from McMaster University on gender streaming transport planning. And I think Kennedy will put a link to that talk in the chat if anyone's interested in following up on that particular topic. That was the topic of the first event in the series. So that's very, very appropriate. Thanks for bringing that up.
And
And
I'll
a
just
very,
really I wanted to briefly mention Vienna. I didn't get the chance to talk about, but is a really interesting example of that gender mainstreaming and the overlap with
okay.
children. Oh yeah, the city's planners back in the 90s, there was a group of women city planners who really worked hard. And one of them I was lucky enough to hear speak a few months back. And she said one of the things you need to do that helps join the dots here, if kids can get around on their own more, it frees up the parents, it frees up the mothers from that role of being the parental taxi service, which is a huge boon to caregivers.
Mhm. No, good point, and thank you for giving us that example. We got lots of questions here. This is great, but let me just start off with one, and then we'll transition pretty quickly. So, you've talked about that children as an indicator series. You had Enrique Penalosa's quote. You've talked about that, making things friendly for children have broader impacts on the community. Can you drill into that a bit? Talk about how a child-friendly planning lens can help your city improve everything: safety, public health, and overall neighborhood quality across the board.
Sure. I think, I think it comes if you like, in a philosophical sense, it comes down to this, children are comparatively more at risk from environmental hazards. So you could say in a way they are a kind of canary in the coal mine, both as human beings, but also in the minds of parents and caregivers. So our willingness to allow children or to accept children in public space, in streets, it shows one way or the other the level of faith that we have in the safety, in the conviviality, in the basic, kind of human qualities of a place. And and so those, in practical terms, a lot of the measures that make places work well for children, reducing traffic danger, improving accessibility and proximity, feelings of social safety, those also apply to, older citizens, to underserved groups, to women, to disabled people. the measures, it's not 100% overlap. I mean, I think that's important, you know, but I think there's a pretty strong overlap, particularly when it comes to realizing the big barriers to all of this. What are those barriers? Car-oriented, sprawling, this kind of single function development is a big barrier that many, that has an adverse impact on many parts of the community.
Okay, so let's say I'm an urban planner and I'm interested in trying to come up with better performance metrics, for my city. I want to understand how to measure, for example, the impact of transportation on quality of life. How would you build these child-centric measures into performance indicators for
Sure.
planning?
Yeah. Okay. Short answer, read my book. There's
Okay.
all right, there's one table which actually has a list of about 50 or 60 indicators. So it's a shopping list on under different headings. These are what you might call output or outcome indicators. So they're not impact indicators. That's harder, but you can still find them. You can do surveys of children's quality of life. You can ask children, what do you think about your neighbourhood? How easy is it for you to play? And there has been some good work. Wales, for example, the country of Wales, has got a process called play sufficiency. I'll say that again, play sufficiency, which is where municipalities assess how well they're providing for children's play, and there are tools for doing that. There are tools out there in my book and elsewhere that can actually embed some of this into the bureaucracy of municipalities.
Okay, thank you. Kennedy, audience questions, go for it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tim, for the presentation. We have a lot of great questions, and I just want to remind everyone we may not be able to get to all of these questions, so just a heads up. Someone asked, from the list of child-friendly cities and from personal experience, it seems like European cities are much more child-friendly and pedestrian-friendly in general. How much of that is city age and history, and how much is choice and priorities? How much is it something else?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's the right question. I think it is clearly true that mainland European cities, on the whole, have got historic cores, and the city centre is often dense and has a kind of human scale. The industrialization that we saw in the 19th century in many European cities panned out in a slightly different way, I think, than in the US. But then the really big difference is the extent to which North American cities became car oriented with the growth of cars. Now that all of that has happened in European and is happening in other parts of the world in the global south. But and actually the global south is a really interesting challenge. I mean, we could again talk a lot about that. But I think um, the fact that many European cities have got those chunks of the city that are that are relatively dense and human scale and that have, if you like, survived the motor age better than in North America. That is really important. And what then happens is that a small handful, because I mean I talked about 10 or 20 cities in Europe, that's still not a big sample, but still they have kind of been able to go in the direction and to build on that historical and geographical set of assets. But we're seeing that in other parts of the world as well. I mean, I write about Recife in Brazil. Fortaleza is another Brazilian city. Uh, Actually, there's a very interesting conversation about informal settlements and to be simple, poor neighborhoods in many parts of the world have got some of the qualities that I talked about. They're often neighborhoods where cars are not particularly dominant, that are comparatively dense, that have got a lot of local facilities. So if you can tackle some of the poverty related challenges in those in the favelas, for example, I visited favelas in Brazilian cities, then but you preserve the basic spatial qualities of those neighborhoods, you could really solve a lot of the problems that are facing large populations in low and middle income countries.
Great answer. Someone else asked, do you have examples of including children in designing and planning? And how was it done from public participation perspective?
Okay, yes, I've got lots, and I've got quite a lot to say about that. I won't try and rehearse it now. What I will do is sort of issue a couple of warnings because it's very easy to be either tokenistic about children's participation, um, or to get really bogged down and to actually create a lot of unnecessary friction and to go over a lot of ground that you don't need to go over. Okay, we know the basics about what makes neighborhoods work well for children. We know that because children have been telling us that for 20, 30, 40 years. And there's a whole body of work coming out of UNICEF, and other agencies that documents that. So the really short answer is make your participation smart. And I'd say one last thing, try and create the space for the adult decision makers to actually hear what children say. Yeah, not to just read a report or look at a display in a library, but to be in the same physical space with groups of children. Even better, walkabouts. Okay, neighborhood walkabouts can be incredibly compelling ways to get the light bulbs to go off in the minds of decision makers and administrators.
Great. Another question we have, and this might be our last one. I'm not sure. We might be able to fit two in. I'm not positive. But someone asked, how do you see this being most effectively brought into municipal policy? So like local policy.
Um, Okay, I talk a lot in my book about the value of a champion, and it's people as well as policies. So, and in fact, if I had one more slide, it probably would have been a sort of slide of my implementation model. And at the heart of that model is a person, not a policy. I think this sort of change needs a catalyst. It needs somebody with energy and who's effective at joining the dots. And on the whole, I think the policies come later. That's a personal view.
That's great. Harvey, what do you think? Do you have time for another question?
And one more, sure, why not?
Okay. And again, these are really great questions, everyone. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. Here's a one that I think you might be able to answer quickly. What child-friendly urban planning techniques tend to be the most used or have the biggest positive impact out of the ones you've seen? I know you kind of touched on this already a bit in your
Yeah.
presentation.
I mean, I do, and I guess I'd make a bit more of a case for sort of the tactical. So, in other words, looking at physical changes you can make in a street or in a public space or a square that are physical. They really do change how the space is, but they are low cost and potentially reversible. Because what you do with those sorts of interventions is you can demonstrate and you can get people to feel how a space can be different, how it can feel when it's not dominated by cars or when it's got some playful or attractive social space. And then you can build on that to go to scale and to make more permanent change.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure everyone learned a lot from it. I want to remind everyone that this is going to be posted on our YouTube. So if you want to share it, that would be great. I know many of you already expressed interest in doing so. So I'll let Harvey close us out.
Yeah, thank you. And Tim, you're talking about tactical urbanism there, right? Just doing these provisional, temporary, demonstrate proof of concept before scaling up and applying elsewhere permanent
Yeah,
with permanent changes, right?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. That was a great talk. As you can see from the questions, the audience really responded to this. I think you're raising some very important issues. You know, we make cities friendly for families, for children. They're friendly for everyone. And so I think that's a very, very critical challenge for us here in the 21st century, not only in places like America, which have suffered from car dependence, but as you mentioned, the global South, where most of the cities still have not been created that will be created in the 21st
Right.
century. Okay, thank you, everyone. I just want to announce our next webinar in the Cities for All series, which will be Friday, March 27th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, United States. And we'll have Allie Kennington and Kyle Seam from the Kelsey. The Kelsey is an organization that engages with the disabled community to design affordable housing that is accessible and meets the need of people with disabilities. And they will speak about building cities for everyone. Disability forward housing futures. Obviously, a very important topic too in our Cities for All series. On another note, I want to announce that 2026 is Cura's silver anniversary. We were founded in April 2001, and we are excited to announce a special event commemorating a quarter century of Cura. On April 10th, 2026, join Cura, our founders, university leaders, and community partners for a celebration where we will look back at 25 years of impact and look forward to the next 25 years of Cura. This event will be held at a location adjacent to the OSU campus. So if you're in town or you can be in town for a long weekend, it's a Monday, come on, visit Columbus. It's a great place to visit, and you can help celebrate our silver anniversary. And Kennedy just put in the chat a registration link if you're interested in participating in our celebration. We hope to see you there. Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Tim, for a great talk, and everyone, have a good weekend. Bye.